It is 2024 Pride, and we have been discussing the legislation and the court cases that have given our LGBTQIA plus siblings basic, simple rights, like the right to get freaky in the privacy of their own homes without getting arrested. That was a thing, yeah. Recently, we have been discussing their right to get married because for a while, that was not a basic right that they had. Yeah. Yesterday, we talked about Obergefell versus Hodges, and we will end Marriage Week with the Respect for Marriage Act, which was signed in 2022. Let's talk about it. The Respect for Marriage Act was passed after Roe v. Wade was overturned. You see, the previous Congress dragged their feet in protecting our basic rights until after a woman's right to choose was lost. And if I sound bitter, it's because I am. Yeah. I know you're thinking that we didn't actually lose the right. The decision was given back to the states, right? Yeah. And how many states have passed abortion bans again? Yeah. And if the Republicans take the White House in 2024, aren't they talking about a national abortion ban? But that's not why we're here. No, we're here because it's Pride Month. So let's talk about legislation that was passed because the Democrats finally got their heads out of their asses. Shall we? Let me stop sounding bitter. All right then. Now, December 13th, 2022, President Biden signed the Respect for Marriage Act into law. This bill repeals the Defense of Marriage Act. We talked about that. That's DOMA, right? Which was already repealed, right? Because United States versus Windsor, Obergefell versus Hodges, right? It essentially repealed DOMA, but this one does it for real, I guess. Whatever. The new law, Respect for Marriage Act, creates federal statutory protections for same-sex and interracial marriages. That's the addition, interracial marriages. It prohibits states from denying the validity of marriages performed in other states on the basis of the sex, race, ethnicity, or national origin of the individuals in the marriage. A bit of history. We discussed how the Supreme Court ruled in Obergefell versus Hodges that the 14th Amendment requires all U.S. states to recognize same-sex marriages. However, this decision was put in jeopardy in 2022. Y'all remember that, don't you? Let me remind you. Now, it was bad enough that they overturned Roe v. Wade, but then Justice Clarence Thomas in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization argued that the court should reconsider the Obergefell decision. Why? Well, because Roe v. Wade was cited in the Obergefell versus Hodges decision. So, Democratic-controlled Congress panics and finally tries to guarantee basic rights for everybody. Months before the midterms, they get the Respect for Marriage Act pushed through, which, as we said, overturns DOMA, requires the federal government to recognize same-sex and interracial marriages, codifies parts of Obergefell and the 2013 ruling in United States versus Windsor and the 1967 ruling in Loving versus Virginia. In addition, it compels all U.S. states and territories to recognize the validity of same-sex and interracial marriages if performed in a jurisdiction where such marriages are legally performed. Okay? Now, this is important because Clarence Thomas wants to re-review any decision that was based on substantive rights. Substantive rights, which we will discuss later, he says, are not covered under the Constitution. And I loathe agreeing with that man, but he is correct. There is nothing in the Constitution saying that substantive rights are covered, unless you go with unenumerated rights, in which case a case could be made. But he wants to re-review everything that was based on substantive rights, and Obergefell versus Hodges would be one of those cases. But ultimately, the Respect for Marriage Act was passed just in case Obergefell versus Hodges was reversed like Roe versus Wade was. Just in case. It took women losing their bodily autonomy for the Democratic-controlled Congress to realize that it was a possibility. Mind you, women only had the right for 51 years. I'm 52. It's almost reasonable to think that it would never be taken away, with the exception of the fact that pro-lifers had been working on getting Roe versus Wade overturned from the second it was decided, and they'd been, talking about it. So I don't know why people were shocked and surprised when it was overturned. Just like they've been talking about overturning Obergefell from the second it was decided. So it took women losing their bodily autonomy for Congress to be like, hey, maybe gay people might lose their right to be legally married. Maybe we should pass something like, I don't know, the Respect for Marriage Act.